Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
You know, on this podcast, we've interviewed a number of experts who specialize in various realms of men's health, physical health, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, and otherwise. But I believe that this is the first time we've brought on a sex coach who specializes in working with male clients. And I suppose that means we finally found someone who likes talking about masturbation and pornography more than I do. So who is that man? That man is Cam Fraser. Now, Cam, like I said, is a men's sex coach, but he's also a certified counselor. He's a yoga teacher and a tantric practitioner, all of those realms with which he draws upon in his coaching. And you'll hear about that today. Now, Cam is pretty highly regarded in the sex education communities that Bryan and I have tapped to bring individuals' wisdom onto this podcast. Many people that we've interviewed before follow Cam and his research and his wisdom that he shares on Instagram, and I'm going to recommend that you follow him on Instagram because he's a wealth of knowledge, very well researched, backed by science, linking that in the show notes. So Cam specializes in helping men realize that there's nothing wrong with you if you experience things like premature ejaculation, low libido, erectile dysfunction, having a difficult time controlling that sexual energy in bed, being dragged around by your sexual energy if it's hyperactive. Instead, he provides you practical guidance on how to take control over these areas of your sexual life, which in turn brings confidence not only to the bedroom, but also to all the other areas of your life. He also runs the Men's Sex and Pleasure podcast, and he shared with me some of the favorite episodes that his listeners love, like sexual kung fu and semen retention, how to have multiple orgasms for men, penis size, working with what you've got. And so I've linked his podcast in the show notes as well. And he's also a new father of a 4-month-old son named Fergus. Congratulations, brother. So in this episode, Cam gets into a number of practical techniques to help train yourself to last as long as you want in the bedroom. For instance, he talks about the 3 ways that men tend to masturbate and how none of them train you on how to have control over how long you last in bed. So he then goes into how to start masturbating differently so you can enhance the control and your lasting power, why using lube during masturbation may actually help you last longer with your partner, 2 practices that he recommends to enhance ejaculation control, and then finally he goes into this practice of pleasure mapping and how this practice enhances your zones of pleasure that you experience and why using this practice, this pleasure mapping, is an excellent intimacy building tool to use with your partner. And FYI, because Cam is in Perth, Australia, in a 12-hour time difference and also navigating the chaotic schedule of being a new father, the only time we were able to coordinate this episode, Bryan couldn't swing. So for a couple weeks in a row, you've been missing your boy Bryan. He sends his regards, but we're sure to get him back on the show soon. Enjoy this conversation with Cam Fraser on training techniques to last as long as you want in bed. Cam, brother, we are in the complete opposite time zones. It is 9 p.m. New York City time. It is 9 a.m. on the following day in Perth, Australia. Man, we did this once before when I came on your podcast, which is Men, Sex, and Pleasure with Cam Fraser. Dude, it's so good to see you again because the last time I spoke to you, you were not a father and now you are 4 months in. How's that experience been treating you, buddy?
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, thanks for having me on your show, man, and returning the favor. Fatherhood's been crazy, dude. Like it's four wild months of having a little son, and before that was 9 months of pregnancy, and then before that it was the conception and that whole journey. So it's just been over a year of this like really intense container, just a lot of learning, a lot of we talk about inner child work, right? And kind of healing your childhood wounds. And I thought, yeah, you know what? I've done a lot of that. I'm good to go. I could probably do a little bit more work. Yeah. But now with a literal little child in front of me, like all this inner child stuff is coming up. And so it's just a big cauldron of learning and processing and just really testing all the things that I talk about, right? Like I talk the talk quite well, but now it's really walking the walk, I suppose. So it's been great, man. It's just been an immense period of time in my life and my partner's life. So enjoying it. And it's getting really rewarding now that he's able to give back to us. My little son, his name's Fergus. So he's now smiling and laughing and playing with us. And yeah, it's just really lovely, man. It's now that he's at this age, he's more than just like a sleeping, shitting and crying,
machine.
Blob. Yeah. And now he's able to actually play with us, which is fantastic. So it's lovely, man. It's lovely. And it's just going to be continual learning and continual growing, I feel.
Well, congratulations on that, brother. And maybe in the back half of this podcast, we can talk a little bit about how that's potentially changed or impacted your intimate love life if you're at liberty to talk about that, because, I know a lot of our listeners are parents, fathers, and it's one thing to take guidance from a sex coach who's single. I'm a single guy. I'll take sex coaching from anybody who's out there who's got credentials that I resonate with. But for someone who's a father, who's also a husband, that narrows the field of who they want to hear from, because obviously it's a very different lifestyle. So if we have some time at the back end and you're at liberty to talk about it, I'd love to ask you a few questions about your experience there too.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, you've just reminded me of a comment that I got from someone after I posted something about masturbation the other day. And they were like, that's all well and good and that sounds really great, but I've got a screaming 4-year-old, son that runs around the house all day, every day. Where the hell am I going to get half an hour to go and do a self-pleasure practice? So I was like, and it just hit me like a wave. I was like, oh, okay, now there's a whole different conversation to be had now about finding time and prioritizing that. And so yeah, I resonate with that, man, and would love to speak more into that later on if we can.
Good. Well, let's dive in, man, because you're probably, of all the people we brought on this podcast, you're probably the person who talks about masturbation and pornography more than I do, which is awesome. And that's a high bar to set. That's a high bar to clear. And, I think the first place I want to start, Cam, just for our audience's sake, because you have a, pretty well-rounded background being a sex coach, which I know is like your passion. You're a certified counselor. You're a yoga teacher. You're a tantric practitioner. What would you say, though, sits at the center of your work and who you work with?
So you asked me this just off air, and I was reflecting on it as we were starting the podcast. And I'm thinking my own philosophy with regards to the work that I put out is it's geared toward myself, really. At the end of the day, the information that I share is the information and education that I wish I'd received about 10, 12, 15 years ago when I was transitioning from a teenager into a young man. And really at the core of it, it's challenging and rewriting our societal narratives around masculinity and sexuality and offering examples, alternatives, and new kind of unique and healthy stories for men to pursue with regarding their the expression of their masculine energy, their sexuality, just how they show up in the world as a sexual man. And I can go deeper into this, but there's just a lot of shame and anxiety and guilt and fear and all these resistances and blockages to showing up in the world as an authentic, genuine, sexual human being. And I'm a dude. So I talk about that from my perspective. And yeah, so that's who I work with, is people that kind of resonate with that and share a particular lived experience with myself. A lot of the people that resonate with my work are people that are in my demographic, which is straight white dudes. So that's what I speak into. So those are the people that tend to resonate with my work quite a lot. Hopefully that answers your question, man. The core is just changing and challenging those narratives around masculinity and sexuality.
Yeah, man. I mean, when you talk about what is a healthy sexual masculine man look like, it's kind of hard to pinpoint because there aren't really any role models that are out there. I mean, we know the porn stars and the players, these are the guys because they get the most sex. They're the ones who get the most attention. But when it comes to if I were to name who's a sexual role model that I wanted to model my life after, there weren't really any, right? I had to learn kind of from my own trials and tribulations. So to make this really tangible for our listeners, and, I asked you, because you run your own podcast, which I referenced earlier, and we'll talk about it again. I asked you off air, what are the most powerful topics that your audience likes? And you said that the episodes that are most downloaded tend to be very practical, very technique oriented around men learning to harness their sexual energy, learning how to ejaculate when they want to versus being commanded to. So maybe before we get down into the tactics and the techniques, because I know those are things that are going to be very valuable to men, the men who come into your world, Cam, who want to get coached and educated, probably come to you with a series of, I have things that I want to fix. And what are those things that they come to you saying, please help me, Cam, fix fill in the blank?
Yeah. So the way that I think about this is like, they don't necessarily think that the question is like, can you help me fix this? The question is there something wrong with me because of this? So the way that I start any type of coaching with a client is normalizing their experiences and talking about how common they are. Because a lot of us as guys, we don't talk about sex very often. So we tend to like live in silence with regards to sexual concerns and sexual issues, think that we're the only ones getting affected by them, when most of the time, regardless of our socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity, we're all, at the same rate experiencing certain sexual insecurities and difficulties. So that's what I tend to do firstly, is like help these guys realize that nothing's wrong with them because they're having some erectile difficulties, or nothing's wrong with them because they're ejaculating quite quickly, or nothing's wrong with them because they are finding it difficult to maintain a high libido, or whatever it might be that they're coming towards me to work with me for. So there's that kind of like surface level, like this is happening, like I'm not getting an erection, or I'm coming quite quickly, or I'm not as aroused as I once was. But underneath that is the fear of like, I'm broken and something's wrong with me. I need someone to kind of reassure me. And so that's where I start, is not necessarily at the like surface level where I give you techniques and strategies and things to do, because I can do that till the cows come home. But if you're not addressing the underlying psychology of you feeling like less of a man, or you not feeling worthy enough, or you feeling like you're a failure, or you feeling whatever it is, that something's wrong with you and you're broken, then you're going to do those techniques your whole life, but you're never going to actually progress much, unfortunately. So that's where I start, is with that kind of underlying psychology. And then from there, once that's been talked about and deconstructed and rewritten, then we go, okay, now we've got a strong foundation. Let's build upon that with some strategies and tips and techniques.
Let's hit on something there that you talked about regarding coming in with this question of, is there something wrong with me? Maybe some of those experiences that have called them to question themselves, is there something wrong with me, have happened with another partner. Many of those situations that you referenced around either erectile dysfunction or ejaculating too quickly have most likely happened with their partner. Can you speak to some of the shame that maybe some men have been exposed to from their partners, from those circumstances, just to kind of to normalize that? And if you can get specific around some examples, the better.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of expectations around what men, quote unquote, should do in the bedroom. There's a lot of shoulding when it comes to our sexuality, especially as men, as we express it. I mean, and before I get into that, like, women share those same stories, right? Women have the same expectations as we do of ourselves, because they get the same education as us. They have the same narratives around masculinity and sexuality. So what can happen is we might be getting into a sexual scenario and we're maybe struggling to get an erection, right? And there's a myriad reasons why we might struggle to get an erection. I won't get into that just now, but something that can happen is, if we're struggling to get an erection, then this story can pop up of something's wrong with me, right? Which is what I've identified before. Something's wrong with me because I'm not getting an erection. What the hell is wrong? But a story can pop up for a lot of women in those scenarios as well, of like, what's wrong with her? Is she not attractive enough? Is she not hot enough? Is she not doing that thing that you like or that you've seen in porn? Or there's a lot of self-worth issues that can pop up for her. And then underneath that story is usually then, no, I'm fine. What the hell is wrong with him? Why is he not able to get it up? Like, because they have the expectation as well that you should just have an erection straight away as soon as you feel aroused. At the change of wind direction, you should just be able to get an erection, right? At the drop of a hat. So if that doesn't happen immediately, then her story as well can be, oh, what the hell is wrong with him? What's going on there? And similarly for us, if we transcend that, like, what's wrong with our body, what's wrong with us, then the underlying story can then also become, no, I'm fine. She's just not hot enough for me, or she just doesn't tick a lot of the boxes for me, or I'm just not that attracted to her, or whatever it is. We get this kind of self-blame and then cross-blame, where we blame each other. And oftentimes that's where it ends. We never really have a conversation about it. We never unpack it and never talk about it. So we end up having this kind of resentful, toxic sexual, sex life, right? Sexual experience, which can bleed over into relationships. So that's like one example. Another thing can happen when like if we're coming too quickly, a lot of guys, I just did a whole 45-minute YouTube video on this actually, which I'm about to release. But the way premature ejaculation or just ejaculating before you really want to is kind of framed for a lot of people. There's a couple of different ways. It could be like one of the joking ways is that it's like considered a compliment. It's like, oh, you were just so attractive. You're just so hot. I was just, you were just, it was just too much for me.
Yeah. You can only use that so many times, right?
Right. But that story is inherently problematic because it outsources your arousal and your pleasure and your function to your partner. It's not your fault that you came. It's her fault, right? Again, we get into this blaming scenario here where we're not taking responsibility for our own experience and for our own function. So, regardless of kind of what happens, like another thing can happen with delayed ejaculation as well. Like if you struggle to ejaculate, right? If you've had too much to drink, this is definitely true in my lived experience, getting whiskey dick or brewer's droop and you just can't come no matter how long you go for. Another story can pop up of, again, for her, like, is he not enjoying himself? Because we've conflated ejaculation with a man's pleasure. We only know sex is successful if he ejaculates, right? That's how we know we can tick the box and say that was a good sex because he came, right?
That was a good sex.
That was a good sex. That was successful. We achieved something, right? So that can bring up a whole bunch of stories as well. There's a lot of unspoken and unrecognized symbolism around what ejaculation means for a heterosexual couple in sex. So all these things can just really trigger stories for us about self-worth and like whether the sex was good as well. Certain things have to kind of be there for a lot of us in order for sex to be considered good. Like she has to orgasm or I have to ejaculate or there has to be penetration. That's another big one. Like if we don't have penetrative sex, then it doesn't quote unquote count as sex. And so these bring up all these stories that we have around sex, which we never really get from anywhere. They just kind of start to build up with, in us. And then we maybe watch porn and we watch movies and they just kind of get reinforced and then they're never really challenged until we do some of this work.
I love it, man. And, before we dive into some of the more technique oriented practices, maybe it would be helpful to kind of set the stage for the why, like why these practices matter. And let's say, because I know you have a 6-week course that's called Outperform a Porn Star that people can link to in Instagram. And I know you use that term cheeky because you say it's not really that hard to outperform a porn star because they're having really terrible sex.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And what you're talking about is how to create intimacy and connection and also to control your own libido and ejaculate on your command. And I'm sure there's other things that you can add to that. But let's just say that you have men who come to you in this place of, is there something wrong with me? And then you help them navigate to this higher ground where now they have control of their libido. Now they have command over when they ejaculate, can dance with their partner to this place where they're in total authority of that. What are the changes that man experiences? Like how does he feel in his inner world from where he started with you to then ending up in that place?
I'm a big believer in our sex life and our sexuality not existing in isolation, right? It doesn't just exist in a vacuum. And my opinion is that our sexuality and our understanding and our experience of our sexual energy, it influences and it impacts the rest of our life. And I kind of think about this, the way that you show up in life, right? The way that you engage with life, the way that you experience life in general is the same way that you have sex, right? If you find it very difficult to enjoy the pleasures in life, like food or going out into nature or just like stopping and surrendering into a moment and just kind of being present with it, then you're going to have the exact same issues in your sex life. From what I've observed anyway, you're going to find it very difficult to experience pleasure. You're going to find it very difficult to connect deeply with your partner and be present in that moment if you're struggling to do that outside of the bedroom as well. So so that's a two-way street. You can either do the work. This is how a lot of guys kind of start. They do the personal development work. They do some spiritual work and they kind of really start to tune in to life in general. And then they start to notice that things are now popping up for them in the bedroom because they're starting to change things in their life. Things are starting to maybe shift a little bit in their bedroom and they might need a bit of guidance. And that's when they come and see me, for example. Or the other way around, they start doing things in the bedroom because they want to learn how to have multiple orgasms or they want to learn how to control their ejaculation or whatever it is. And so they start at that point, they start changing, they start recognizing how to deepen their presence with themselves, how to experience more pleasure by themselves, how to connect deeper with their partner, how to facilitate conversations about desires and fantasies and boundaries. They learn more about these things experientially. They notice that has a ripple effect out into their life and they start all of a sudden having these deeper conversations with their friends. They start talking about boundaries in a non-sexual setting. They start saying no to things, or they start explicitly asking for things that they want outside of the bedroom. They start noticing how their relationship with their families change, with their kids change. And that's because, again, I think these two things are inextricably linked. I think our sexuality is fundamentally a core part of how we show up in the world, of how we are as human beings, right? It informs all of our relationships, whether we are supposed to express it or, repress it, or whether we're supposed to talk about it or not talk about it, or whatever it is. Our sexuality is always there under the surface, informing the way that we talk to everyone in our lives, whether they're a family member or a colleague or a religious authority or a child, right? Our sexuality is there under the surface, informing the way that we interact with these people. So that's how I kind of frame it, as like, if you're going to do stuff on your sexuality, understand it more robustly, get a kind of bigger picture with regards to how your sexuality impacts you, then that's going to have a knock-on effect to the way that you show up in life, because you're going to understand more about yourself. You're going to know more about what it is that turns you on and what it is that you want and what your desires are. And you're also going to know where your limitations and boundaries are, and you're going to be able to voice those a bit more. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, man. I mean, I feel that because like when you're in that rhythm and groove where you're really laying it down in the bedroom, like you walk around that day with a little extra hop in your step, a little extra straighten in your spine. You're walking into the boardroom. You're like, I got this. And conversely, when you're in the bedroom and let's say multiple times things just didn't go your way, you don't know how to communicate it. You're feeling disempowered. It ends before you want it to. Maybe you feel ashamed or embarrassed. That carries over into how you show up in the gym or how you show up in the business transaction. I mean, this stuff, like you're saying, is inextricably linked. So with all of that said, then let's get into some of the specifics. You talk a lot about masturbation techniques. You talk a lot about ejaculation control. You talk about semen retention. You also talk about multiple orgasms for men. It seems like there's a grab bag. So why don't you just like close your eyes, pretend like you're reaching to a bag, pick out one of the topics and let us know what we're going to be talking about, man.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind just as I'm here thinking about it is masturbation, the way that you masturbate. I talk to so many men about the way that they masturbate, and I oftentimes get one of three answers, if I ask them how they do it. And the first is like what we're doing now, sitting in front of a computer screen, right, on an office chair, looking at a screen and being hunched over, and one hand's on the mouse of their computer, the other hand's on their cock, and they're just kind of, going through the motions, jerking off to their favorite tube site until they climax.
That's a hot image. Yeah. Hunched over the computer in the dark of the
like
night.
Little chimpanzee just, furiously jerking off. The other is like on their phone. So like, using a phone and like lying down on a couch or in bed or
bathroom somewhere.
Bathroom. Yeah, exactly. Swiping or, looking at their little tiny phone screen and jerking off. And then the last one is a little bit different, slightly different, but it's like in the shower. So it's like behind closed doors. You got a bit of free time in the shower. And so they'll just like try and get it done as quickly as possible. Here in Australia, if you have a shower for too long, you can get the Water Corporation called on you for wasting water. So, you try and get it done as effectively as possible. And so you just go through the motions. So in all three of those scenarios, it's like, firstly, it's very going through the motions oriented. It's just like, I just need to get this done with. I need to, it's not about being in the moment. It's not about necessarily enjoying it. It's about trying to get something from your cock, trying to get an ejaculation, trying to get that little dopamine squirt, trying to get that instant gratification from the masturbation.
What else should you be focused on? Because I think for so many guys, of course, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So what else should I be trying to do, Cam?
Right. So, so to shift this, the way that I talk about this is like, instead of masturbation, which has a lot of negative connotations to it, like I've just kind of described, we kind of think of self-pleasure here. And the shift here is like, self-pleasure is whatever you yourself find pleasurable, right? So it might not even involve touching your genitals. It could just involve like eating some nice food. It could just involve like sitting and breathing for a few moments, or it could just involve like giving yourself a lymphatic massage and just kind of draining after you've done some sport, just kind of giving yourself a bit of a stretch and a bit of a massage, try and release some of that stagnant fluid. So whatever it is to kind of induce some sort of pleasurable sensation in your body, getting a massage, eating, all these things are pleasurable. That is what we should be focusing on when it comes to masturbating, right? We should be bringing in, okay, this is great, and there's this gratification to it. I'm kind of getting something, but oftentimes that can be very depleting for a lot of guys. And afterwards they usually share that it kind of feels a little bit shameful. They feel a little bit dirty or guilty, or that it's detracting from their sex life, all these things, which call me crazy, but sex is supposed to be pleasurable, whether it's sex with another person or sex with yourself, and it's supposed to be enjoyable and fun. And if that's how you're feeling after masturbation, then things need to shift and change. And so one of the ways that I talk about shifting and changing that is like, firstly, instead of trying to take an ejaculation from your genitals, like you kind of like your cock's got a job to do and you're trying to beat it out of it, think about giving to your genitals. Like, what could you do? Like, what would it look like if you were to just like, instead of emptying your cup and depleting yourself, what if you were giving back to your body? What if this self-pleasure time was an opportunity to kind of nourish your balls, nourish your cock, nourish your body, and to fuel yourself up, so that when you went to have sex with your partner, you weren't coming from this place of depletion, you were coming from this place of abundance, of overflowing with pleasure, overflowing with sexual energy, and you're able to give from that place of abundance, not from this place of emptiness, which is often how a lot of guys frame their masturbation.
So how does that work, Cam? Are you suggesting that in some of these self-pleasure sessions, like masturbation, if I'm bringing that frame of not taking something, what I'm actually doing is nourishing, are you suggesting I don't ejaculate during that masturbation session? I'm actually stimulating myself, bringing energy to my body, and then with the intention of bringing that to my partner, assuming I have a partner.
Yeah, so that's something I encourage people to experiment with, is taking a break from ejaculation. There's a lot of esoteric reasons why you might want to do this, but to keep it like really, really practical, like is we've conditioned ourselves to experience sex and masturbation and pleasure in a certain way, right? If we're thinking about how often we masturbate, and from when we started masturbating, if every single time that you've masturbated, you've ejaculated, right? And you've oftentimes, like, guys will not only have an ejaculation, but also have a particular type of stroke, a type of friction-based stroke that gets them to the point of ejaculation. That's the pathway that you've created in your body, right? That's the neural connections that you've made, and you've honed that in and you've refined it. And it's been something that you've like really entrenched in your kind of somatic patterning. So you've conditioned yourself to experience pleasure in a certain way. And if that's the only way that you experience pleasure, if that's the only avenue that you have to explore that part of your sexuality, it's kind of like eating a meal. It's a good meal, right? It gets the job done. It's satisfying. But if you ate that meal for every single mealtime for the rest of your life, you get pretty bored, right? You get pretty dull. It's a great meal, but it's you sometimes want something else, right? Especially if there's another person involved, right? If you're only offering one meal to your partner, then they're going to get pretty bored with that one meal for the rest of their life. So it's essentially like helping you decondition that one particular pathway. It's always going to be there. You can always return back to it, but giving yourself the opportunity to create new, not only neural pathways in the body through neurogenesis, but also through experiencing new sensations in the body and giving yourself an opportunity to just create new avenues to experience and express pleasure, so that when you're with your partner, or even just when you're with yourself, solo sex is just as important in my opinion as partnered sex. But when you're with yourself and when you're with another person, it gives you an opportunity to kind of explore pleasure in a multitude of different ways. You're not just limited to one particular way. So experimenting with taking a break from ejaculation can be one way of doing that. If you're masturbating and you kind of get to that point of ejaculation and you make the decision, I'm not going to ejaculate today, it kind of brings up this story of like, well, what else is there? What else can I do? Right. And a lot of guys, that is framed quite negatively. They're like, well, that's all there is just ejaculation. That's the whole point of masturbation. The reframe or the flip I want to give here is like, well, does that have to be all there is? What else can you do? Can you lean into your curiosity here? Can you lean into I kind of think of this as like, treat it as a bit of a lab experiment, as this kind of scientific experiment. Like, notice what else there is you can do, right? Test things, try out new things and get some feedback and notice how that made you feel. Notice if you really were uncomfortable with something, or notice if you were really enjoying something that you didn't expect. Kind of collect that data, collect that information about yourself, because it's not only valuable to you, it's also valuable to anyone that you have sex with as well. So that's something that I encourage is, taking a break from ejaculation, exploring what else there is there to do when you're with yourself.
Yeah. So I can totally vouch for the taking a break from ejaculation, because it's trained me during sex to actually not race to the finish line, but to enjoy what's in front of me and to enjoy all the pleasure that has nothing to do with ejaculation. Like, when you take ejaculation off the table, everything else becomes heightened. So I definitely know the value in that. So I just want to proselytize that alongside of you. The thing that I'd be curious about, Cam, is like, when you give this homework to the men that come to you for coaching around masturbate differently, try a different stroke, focus on different parts of your body, I would imagine that in the short term, it probably sucks. That's my own fear is like, I'm going to go limp. It's not going to be enjoyable. This is the one thing that I can count on to enjoy. It gives me pleasure all the time. And now you're telling me to go down this path. How long is it going to take before I find something that I enjoy or I recondition myself? These are all the questions going through my mind. And I'm curious what you've learned from your clients on that.
Yeah. So you're hitting the nail on the head here with one of the biggest resistances to doing any sexuality work is this is working for me, right? Like this. And oftentimes that's something that I challenge because I'm like, is that really working for you? Why have you come to see me in the first place? Like if you're having a shitty sex life, then obviously it's not working for you. But that's another way of challenging clients. But my thinking with regards to this is the biggest resistance or this biggest hurdle is, I'm exploring other areas of my body. I'm, focusing on my chest now. I'm focusing on, whatever it is. I'm not focusing specifically on my cock anymore. I'm noticing that I don't have a full of erection anymore. And that can scare a lot of guys. They're going backwards. That's the kind of feeling that they'll often share with me is like, this is having the opposite effect of what I want it to do. And that's because you're, like I said, rewriting pathways in your body. You're giving yourself an opportunity to experience new things. And your body is very good at following habits. It creates patterns and pathways and it likes to take the path of least resistance, which is oftentimes the conditions that we've placed upon ourselves. So your body will go, no, what the fuck are you doing? I know what I'm doing. Don't try and do this over here. You need to come back and ejaculate and stroke, with a lot of friction and do what you have been doing for the last however many years. And so that creates a bit of confusion, right? Creates a little bit of resistance, not only somatically, but also mentally because you think that there's something now wrong because you've lost a little bit of firmness in your erection. Or something else that oftentimes happens, there's like another hurdle a little bit down the track, is when guys really start dropping into pleasure and they've kind of done a bit of the work, they're focusing more on what they're feeling, they start noticing that they kind of become hypersensitive to pleasure and it becomes quite overwhelming. And they start noticing that they're now coming a little bit quicker than they would like to because it's quite overwhelming because they've never had an opportunity or an experience of
that much pleasure.
And it becomes like really overwhelming for them. So we then work through that and that becomes a little bit of a hurdle to overcome. So
that sounds like a great short-term problem to have. Like if you're experiencing so much pleasure that like you're coming too quickly, like I would love to deal with that problem. You know what I mean? And then build my capacity to handle all that pleasure. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. So it's not this linear path at all. There is like, you do this, but something over here kind of happens. So you've got to kind of navigate back over there to, connect back in with your erections and create that safety for your erection to come back and to explore that part of your body again. And then from there, that pleasure comes through. And then when we start interacting with partners as well, a whole bunch of stuff can happen. So it can feel like a bit of a hurdle, especially if our partner's not like something that I notice when I work with guys towards the end of their journey is they're now really comfortable and confident and open and vulnerable when having these conversations about fantasies and desires and wanting to explore new things. And their partner maybe isn't at that point yet. And so one of the elements that I talk about with these guys is how can you lead your partner? How can you be a sexual leader with your partner and help guide them into that space of open communication, talking about what you want, talking about your desires, talking about your boundaries, because that can be a little bit scary for partners. And so one of the other hurdles for guys to overcome is my partner's not receptive to this anymore. My partner wants me to ejaculate, right? Or my partner wants to do a certain thing, wants to just have missionary sex, or doesn't want to do anything else. And so there's another hurdle there with regards to getting your partner to join you in this journey or join you in this process or whatever that might look like.
And to that point, I just want to reference a podcast that we released a few weeks ago. It was about how to have better conversations around sex with Hannah Diendorfer, which is probably 2 or 3 episodes ago. Actually, it released today, Cam, when we're talking here, but like the episode that we're about to air is taking 2 or 3 weeks from now. So yeah, if that is a thing with your partner, I'd refer back to that conversation from a few weeks ago. So got it. Like this is helpful stuff. You have this one post on Instagram that I'm going to link in the show notes called 20 Simple Tips to Last Longer in Bed. If we're talking about ejaculation control, right? Because we're also saying, hey, in certain places, you may want to take ejaculation off the table altogether. What would you say are like the 2 or 3 biggest points of leverage to enhance your control around when you ejaculate? And then maybe on the tail end of that, you can answer the question of like, what are the benefits of not ejaculating every time? Semen retention.
Look, 2 biggest things for me have been learning how to breathe properly So instead of breathing into your chest, into your thorax, start breathing down into your diaphragm, into your belly. It's called diaphragmatic breathing. It's very simple to practice. Here's a simple exercise to do to start practicing it is lie on your back on the floor with your knees bent, with your feet on the ground. Place a book or a shoe or something relatively light on your chest, right? Just over the center of your chest, and then place another book just below your rib cage on your diaphragm and practice breathing into the book that's on your diaphragm just above your navel, and see if you can keep the book on your chest nice and still and make sure that it doesn't raise up and down, and see if you can breathe into that lower book and breathe that up and down. That's a very simple way of learning how to breathe into your diaphragm with a visual aid.
So that is just breathing. You are not jerking off when that happens.
No, but that's the next step, is to then practice jerking off whilst doing that particular breathing, or practice having sex whilst doing that breathing. But get the breathing down first, because if you're layering all the extra stuff on top, it's going to be too difficult to do.
That is so powerful, Cam, because I've noticed when I've been coaching others, a lot of guys don't have awareness around where does their breath come from. And we are chronic chest breathers, right? Because that's our sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight or flight, the go mode. We are anxious. We're wired. We're ready to go. Unconsciously, you'll see men breathing from chest or shoulders up, right? And what you're talking about is activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So with the inhale, that belly presses out like a baby or like a 4-month-old, like you see your son Fergus doing. And like they naturally do it. We've unlearned that. So that practice, do you recommend like a 5-minute practice, a 10-minute practice? Like how often per week?
Yeah, I recommend 5 minutes a day. That's to begin with. And then I kind of think of this as like if you've got going to the gym or you play sport, like you set aside an hour or so to do these things, right? If you've got a spiritual practice, then you set aside time each day or each week to do these things. And so I say the same thing, like self-pleasure, masturbation should be set aside time, like a spiritual practice, like going to the gym. And similarly as well, there'll be times where you don't want to go to the gym, or you don't want to do your spiritual practice, or you don't want to go play sport or whatever it is, but you just make yourself go anyway because you know it's good for you. It's the same thing for a self-pleasure practice. You might not want to do the breathing and the slowing down and the touch and spend 20 minutes doing this, but you make yourself do it anyway, like you would go to the gym, because you know it's going to be good for you. You know you're going to see results, and you know it's a continual thing. You don't go to the gym once and then think that you're going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a continual process, and you shift and learn. Not only do you not go to the gym once, when you do go to the gym, you don't do the same thing every single time at the gym. You switch it up and you change it, and as your body gets used to something, you do a different exercise. And this is the same thing with self-pleasure. It's the same type of practice. So that's what I oftentimes help guys like mindset to get into when we're talking about self-pleasuring and it being like a continual thing, is like it'll shift and change, and there'll be sometimes you don't want to go, but you'll do it anyway. So yeah, start with 5 minutes a day. You can do it like literally as soon as you wake up in the morning, because you're already in bed, you're already lying down, just chuck a shoe on there and then build it up.
I love how you talk about masturbation as like a spiritual practice that you have to commit to on a regular basis. Because I'm about to go on like a boys trip weekend to the Poconos with about 5 guys. And I love the idea of like telling them in the morning, guys, I got this spiritual practice. I need to leave the breakfast table. Oh, are you doing breath work and are you doing meditation? I'll come with you. No, I'm going to go spank one. Give me 10 minutes. So it's my spiritual practice. Cam said I should be doing it every day.
I mean, you can think of like self-pleasure as a meditative masturbation is like the way I try and think about it, is like, you can combine breath work and you can combine energy work. You can combine all these things whilst also touching yourself, right?
That's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Doing those things. Yeah. So breathing is definitely the number one thing it's foundational for me. It's definitely foundational for the work that I do with men. And to speak into something that you shared, it's the reason why it's foundational, the reason why it works is because of the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. Ejaculation, right? Here's a bit of education. Ejaculation is a function of the sympathetic nervous system. It's actually it's a survival response. Ejaculation is a survival response, right? If we weren't ejaculating, then we wouldn't be passing on our genes. We wouldn't be reproducing. We wouldn't be propagating the species. We've studied this. We know ejaculation is mediated by the pudendal nerve, which runs through the perineum, that space in between the genitals and the anus, and it's connected to the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is not responsible for ejaculation. It's responsible for the feeling of orgasm, for the feeling of pleasure, for the sensations that we notice in our body. And sexual function is this beautiful interplay, this dance between those two branches of the nervous system. But and medical textbooks kind of still call it the autonomic or involuntary nervous system, but we know now that we have voluntary control over the nervous system. We can do that. We can have voluntary control by tuning into our breath, right? By Wim Hof is teaching us, right? We can drop into our diaphragmatic breathing, and that engages our parasympathetic nervous system. So when we do that, we bypass the sympathetic nervous system, we bypass the ejaculation reflex, we end up relaxing, we end up lasting longer because we're not building that survival response. We're not building that fight or flight response, right? The fight or flight response is actually fight, flight, freeze, feed, and fuck or fornicate, right? There's actually 5 F's to that fight or flight response. Yeah. So that's the reason why breathing works as well. So that's what I like to do in coaching as well, is like give the practice, but also give the why behind the practice. Why does it work? Great. Why is it a thing that we should be doing? So that's one, is breathing. The other one, you asked me for 2. The other like major shift, I suppose, has been, and this will lead into like the next question, which is what you asked, is like taking a break from ejaculation. I spoke about like rewriting those stories and the conditioning that we have. But one of the ways you can experiment with this, right? Because it's all just well and good to say, okay, I'm going to take ejaculation off the table. Now what? One of the ways that you can play around with this is through a practice called edging, right? So edging is this idea of 1 to 10. 1 is being no arousal whatsoever, and 10 is ejaculation, right? The peak of your arousal. And there's that point at like maybe 9.5, which is often called the point of no return, which is like this, oh God, like it's inevitable. Like I'm going to come, like the even if I stop touching myself right now, the vinegar strokes. Yeah, exactly. You're at that point, you're like, there's nothing I can do now. There's no turning back. The train has left the station. And so like edging is the practice of getting as close up to that edge as possible, that 9, 9.2, 9.3, 9.4, right? Just before that point of no return, and playing around with that area. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can either, like one classical way of doing this is like working all the way up to like a 9.4, getting as close as possible to that edge, and then stopping and just letting yourself subside and go back down to like a 7 or a 6 or whatever, and then building yourself back up to that 9.4 and then letting it drop and subside. And you can do that by breathing. You can do that by just stopping. You can do that by just like sitting and being restful or whatever it is. You know, you can incorporate some squeeze techniques. You might like to squeeze the base of your cock, or you might like to squeeze the head of your cock, or you might like to gently tug and pull the testicles down. All these things kind of create the sensation of not ejaculating, of not wanting to ejaculate. They kind of reverse that urge. The way that I teach edging and what I think is more beneficial for learning how to last longer and building your energetic capacity up for pleasure, which is what we were talking about a little bit before, is build yourself up to that 9, 9.2, 9.3, 9.4, and then stay there for 20 minutes, right? And
wow,
it might not be 20 minutes to begin with, but stay there for 2 minutes. And then the next time you do it, stay there for 3 minutes, and then stay there for 5 minutes, and then stay there for 10, and then stay there for 20. Essentially just stay there for as long as you can. Like if you can build yourself up to an hour, staying in that heightened peak state of arousal, not only are you expanding your capacity to experience pleasure, right, from 2 minutes to an hour, right? You're building up I don't want to say building up tolerance to it. You're expanding your container to experience more. When you then get, with a partner, I suppose, and you're getting closer and closer and closer to ejaculating, or you're getting closer and closer to that peak of your arousal, you're not only going to be able to notice it, right, which is the first key to this, because a lot of guys go from 1 to 10 without really knowing. They're like, where the fuck was 2, 3, 5? What happened, right? They just blast off. So it not only gives you more awareness, like somatically, of the sensations in your body, so that you can like tell your partner, oh, I'm getting quite close. Can we slow down, right? It gives you something to actually communicate to them, but also gives you an opportunity to go, oh, I'm familiar with this space. I know what it feels like to be in a heightened state of arousal. I can hold this. I can do this. I've got this. I don't need to worry that it's going to push me over the edge, because I'm familiar with what it feels like to be in this heightened peak state of arousal. And so you can maintain that with your partner.
I'm really interested, Kim, in this idea of I'm at 9.2 or 3 or 4 and staying there, because I know what it's like to be able to edge to the 9.5 and then to pull back and to like breathe, to let it subside down to a 6 or 7, then go back in. Now I'm at a 9.2. What do I do to stay at a 9.2 and to be able to expand that capacity? So we've got the breath work, focus on the breathing in. How else do I stay there?
So something that I encourage guys to explore is different points of sensation on their cock and their genitals in general. So oftentimes when we're like building up, it's like full length strokes, that gets you to the point of like 9.3, whatever. When you get to that point, then I encourage you to like explore like certain areas like the frenulum, which is that space just below the head of the penis where the shaft kind of meets the glands, kind of looks like a little V. Like that's oftentimes a very sensitive part of the penis for a lot of guys. But the beauty of it is it doesn't give you these big long strokes. So you can just like play around with just one finger with a little bit of lube, whatever, and just kind of flick and lightly stimulate that part of your cock to kind of maintain that level, kind of like staying up at that 9.2, 9.3 space without it kind of tipping you over because you're not doing these big, long, full strokes. Another thing could be like playing around with, some guys have really sensitive testicles, for example. So it could be like just playing around with the testicles, again, with a little bit of lube, some oil, right? Still getting that stimulation, still getting that sensation, still getting that pleasure, but it's not so much that it tips you over that edge. It could be, some guys have really sensitive nipples. It could be like nipple play. Could be anything, but those are some areas to start with, and then just explore other areas of your cock and explore other areas of your body, and just notice that if you still get pleasure from it, but it simmers, it doesn't boil over. That's what we're looking for.
I like that analogy. I've never been a lube guy in personal practice. Do you recommend it? Because it does simulate more like game time conditions, I guess you would call it.
Yep.
And you know, so it's very different to go from a dry hand, which is mine, to a very wet and moist place. And would you advise as a coach, hey, bring in some lube to practice with, because like, you will be ready for game day when that happens?
Yeah, I do advise, man. That's I 100% agree with you for that exact reason as well. Not only is it more pleasurable for you in general, at least in my opinion, but it also, does prep you better for sex with a partner. And, it doesn't have to be lube. It can be oil. Like a lot of guys have used coconut oil, the guys that I've worked with, and you can play around. You can use a thinner lube. You'll experience more sensations from whatever you're putting your penis into, if it's your hand, if it's a toy, whatever it is. A thicker lube will numb some sensations, right? If it's a thicker silicone lube, you won't feel as much. It'll lessen the sensitivity a little bit. So you can explore with that as well. There's plenty of different ways out there, but yeah, I highly recommend incorporating it rather than just giving yourself a dry rub.
Awesome. So Cam, one of the posts you have on Instagram that I thought it's so simple and subtle and yet so easy to overlook in terms of learning what your partner wants in the bedroom. You'd written, learning how your partner touches and pleasures themselves can be a huge learning experience in the bedroom. Just like learning how they touch themselves and then also allowing them to witness you touch yourself. And why is that something that's so important? And I know you have a practice that goes with this.
Yeah, I mean, mutual masturbation by itself is just like a really educational and can be very fun and pleasurable experience. But we oftentimes don't know how we like to be touched, right? Oftentimes, if we're asked that question, and I ask the guys that I work with this all the time, like, what is it that you enjoy? Like, how do you like your partner touching you? And they just go, I don't know, man. Like, however they touch me, like whatever they do, I enjoy.
Yeah, exactly. Just touch me.
Yeah. And when we're with our partners, that anxiety can get even ramped up if our partner asks us, because we don't really know, a lot of us don't really know how to answer that. So a practice to like learn more about how you like to be touched, how your partner likes to be touched. That doesn't necessarily involve like sitting down and intellectualizing it and having a conversation and trying to like really wrap your head around it in that kind of conceptual way. This is a really fun and easy to do body-based exercise called pleasure mapping. So you can do this, the beauty about this exercise, you can do it alone or you can do it with a partner. So I encourage people to start doing it alone and then to incorporate it with their partner. And essentially all it is, as the name suggests, pleasure mapping is you're mapping pleasure across your body. I recommend setting aside like a minimum of 20 minutes to do this, and essentially just starting at your toes, right? You can get fully naked if you want, or you can get down into your underwear, but just starting at your toes and just touching your toes in a certain way. And, most of us have these incredible tools on the end of our arms. We can pinch and scratch and slap and pull and rub and do all these amazing different types of stimulation, and just experiment. Treat this whole thing as a bit of an experiment, as a bit of a data collection exercise where, like I said, you start at your toes and you touch yourself in a bunch of different ways on your toes, and then just work your way from your toes all the way up your body to the crown of your head, and spend 20 minutes just slowly working your way up your body and just noticing what sensations you like, what sensations you didn't like. And you can kind of make a mental note of that. You can write it down. The beauty of doing it with a partner is that they can communicate to them. So if you're doing this exercise with a partner, instead of you touching yourself from the toes all the way to the head, it's your partner doing it. So your partner starts at your toes and then works their way all the way up to the crown of your head. And like if you want to get really specific with it, something that we talked about before was like abstaining from ejaculation or taking a break. One of the ways you can do this exercise within that is skip the genitals for the time being. A lot of us know that we like being touched on our genitals. We don't really know the rest of our body. So you can say, hey, we're going to do this little exercise together, pleasure mapping, and we're going to map the rest of our body. We're just not going to touch the genitals, right, in this 20-minute exercise. The image that comes to mind here is like, this is so nerdy, but I used to play Age of Empires when I was growing up. And
what is that? I honestly don't. I don't know. Should I know?
It's like a little computer game. Hopefully, some people are listening. This will resonate with them. But it's a computer game where you essentially get given this big map, and you've got to go out and explore this map. And you're a bunch of little people, like the Roman Empire, for example. And the map is all pitch black, and the only way you can find out what's on this big, map of terrain is to send your little minions out to go and explore it. And once they've explored it, the map becomes more filled in. And I kind of think of our body as the same way. The only place that we're really familiar with on our body in terms of pleasure, the only part of our map that's filled in is our cock, is our genitals. And so we want to send out our little minions, we want to send out our hands to go and explore the rest of this map, the rest of this terrain, and fill it in, and give us more knowledge about what's out there so that we can communicate that with our partner.
So clarifying question on this, Cam, if I'm doing this on my own, I feel like an important part of this exercise is expectation setting. Because when I hear the word pleasure, mapping, and I'm comparing it to the kind of pleasure that I experience when I touch my genitals, like nothing is going to compare. Like touching my toes, touching my thighs, touching my nipples, like none of those things, at least in my experience, like even come close to what I experience when I'm touching my genitals. So is there some guidance that you would give around, like, look for other subtler forms of pleasure? We're not looking for the same kind of titillating sexual pleasure. Maybe I will experience that if I get the right spot, but like, let's not bank on that. Is a big part of this practice predicated on the expectations I bring into it and what I'm looking for?
Yeah. So a practical way of thinking about this is like using a scaling system. So if touching your genitals is a 10 out of 10 in terms of the pleasure that you experience, and touching your nipples then is like a 6 out of 10, right? It's still enjoyable. And maybe scratching behind your knees is like a 1 out of 10. It really doesn't do it for you, right? Is having a rating system. And that's like one scenario. Another one could be like I use like a 3-tier yes and no system. So if you're touching your genitals is a yes, yes, yes. And scratching behind the back of your knees is a no, no, no. But like touching your nipples is just like a 1 yes. Then, you've got another way of like rating that. And this is, not only beneficial for you, but also with your partner. If your partner's like touching your chest or scratching your face or doing whatever it is at that moment, and you can give them feedback right then, you can be like, yeah, that's a 9 out of 10. I'm actually really enjoying that. Or you don't even have to say I'm really enjoying that. If you've set up the parameters of saying 9 out of 10 is like a lot of pleasure, you can say that's a 9 or that's a 6. That's a 1. Right. Yep. And it gives your partner information about you. And also when you do it with your partner as well, encourage them to do the same thing. Give you feedback when you're touching their toes or working your way up their body to the crown of their head. And again, now that you've got that information, the next time that you have another sexual experience, next time you have sex, in the back of your mind, oh, they're a 9 out of 10 when I stroke their back. I've never done that during sex before. Why don't I do it now? Or I learned that they're a 1 out of 10 when I touch their feet. I've been doing that the whole time during sex. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to do that this time, right? And so it gives you this opportunity. It's a low stakes game, right? The the pleasure mapping game or the pleasure mapping exercise. It's about collecting information. It's about collecting data. So it takes kind of the ego out of it. So you haven't done anything wrong if your partner says that it's a 1 out of 10 because you weren't the one that was doing that, thinking that it was going to cause them pleasure, right? You weren't doing it with the intention of like, I'm trying to get them off with this particular touch. It takes that pressure and that ego and that sting of getting any quote unquote negative feedback, right? None of the feedback is negative. It's just more information in those scenarios, but it gives you that opportunity to explore touch in a way that isn't like, there's no pressure. There's no pressure to get it right? Because you're just collecting that data. That's the beauty of the game as well.
I love this game for a variety of reasons. For those who are in partnership, I love this game as a way of establishing leadership in your relationship, right? So I'm going to bring this practice, this pleasure practice, pleasure mapping. Hey, sweetheart, let's do this pleasure mapping practice. I've got the outline, step into the space with me. And you can also make it a non-sexualized practice where it's, or like, it doesn't have to lead to penetrative sex. It's like all we're doing is mapping the non-genitalia parts of your body that feel good, that feel pleasurable, because I want to become expert in you, that kind of thing. So I love it from that perspective. And then as a single guy who doesn't have a sexual partner right now, I think the thing that has always been missing for me around when I've been told to explore the different parts of my body and explore the zones of pleasure, I've missed that part around the rating system, which is so helpful, right? So like, I believe that there are very few parts of my body that are going to be a 10, like my genitalia. But if I find a place that's a 5, that's a win. It's because it's a 5 if I'm touching it. If my partner's touching it, I'm certain that it's going to be an 8, So I think that part was missing for me. So I'm much more willing to go back and give that pleasure mapping experience a try with this new rating system in hand. So thank you for that, Cam.
No worries, man. And that ties back into that edging practice, right? With regards to like staying at that heightened state of arousal. If you know more about yourself with regards to like where your 7s and 8s are in terms of like your experience of pleasure, you can incorporate those things in that heightened state of arousal. More than likely, they're going to be higher up, right? Because when we're doing a pleasure mapping practice, oftentimes we just kind of drop into it. We're not in a heightened state of arousal to begin with. And so we know that when we're not in those headspace or that arousal space, things don't have that heightened sensitivity that they might do when we are in that space. So incorporate those things again when you're in that heightened state of pleasure, and notice if they kind of keep you up in that heightened state of arousal. That can be another strategy of incorporating that in.
Love that. Cam, I wanted to first thank you for starting the conversation in such an appropriate place, which is around letting guys know that whatever they're experiencing, they're not alone. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just that we haven't talked about this stuff. And so there's things that we can do about either erectile dysfunction or controlling our ejaculation, learning how to edge, mapping out our pleasure zones when we have the tools, when we talk about this stuff. And so you've given us a lot of information and really practical techniques that we can employ by ourselves or with our partner today. So thank you for all of that, man. And if people want more access to your work, which one of the things I really appreciate about your work when I follow on Instagram is it's a great collection of sometimes very short, quick hitting nuggets of wisdom that I can metabolize, also mixed in with some like really scientific, well-researched information about our anatomy and how our bodies work, how our dicks work, and how to last longer in bed. And I really appreciate that about you. So you're one of the few people who, when I'm scrolling and I see some sex information, that I actually stop and read the caption and go deep on, because you always put a lot of emphasis in behind the research, and that's very valuable. So if the men here who have listened have really benefited from your work and want to continue to follow you, where would you point them?
Thank you so much for your feedback as well with regards to my social media. I put a lot of time into it, so I'm glad that it's landing. So that would be the first place is head to the Instagram, which is @thecamfraser. My little guarantee is that if you jump on there, that you'll learn something new. I try and be as educational as possible. So hopefully you'll receive that. I also have a website, which is cam-fraser.com. And on there, as well as on my social medias, you can find access to that Outperform Porn Star course that we were talking about before. And if you want to work with me one-on-one, there's an intake form on there. And yeah, just reach out. I'm really open to people sending me messages. I try to respond and reply to everyone that messages me. So yeah, if people want to chat, I'm open to it.
On your one-on-one coaching services, Cam, who is the ideal person coming to you that you'd like to work with?
Firstly, guys that are open to putting in the work. You'll probably find this as well, man. One of the banes of my work is giving a guys a bunch of home assignments to do, and then a month goes by and I jump on a call with them and they haven't done anything. And I often say you'll get out what you put in. So that's my first one is if you're not ready to actually change and do stuff, then I'm not necessarily probably going to be the right coach for you. But also like in terms of like the type of clients that really land with me is maybe someone who's read one of Mantak Chia's books, or they've maybe read David Data's book, and they are like, it sounds really cool, but I don't really know how to implement or integrate or actually do anything with this information. Like, yeah, I kind of am interested in it. It's intriguing to me. I resonated with it, but I don't know what to do with it. That's the type of guy that I really land with and that really resonates with my work.
That's great. I'm glad you said that, because I know there are many parts of the multi-orgasmic man that I read where I'm like, that's great. And then it's like, I don't know how to put that into practice on my own, or I tried it. It doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, man. I'm glad I asked that question. Glad you clarified. So thanks, brother, again, for all the work that you're doing. Thanks for serving our community here, man. And I'll see you on the Instagram.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Since this episode was chock full of practices and techniques that you can put into practice to train yourself on how to last as long as you want in bed, the call to action today is pick one and practice it. Try it for the next week. Try it for the next 30 days. Try it once just to take what you've learned in this episode today and put it into practice. Otherwise, it's just going to be intellectual masturbation. There's your masturbation pun for the day. Take something you learned, put it into practice so that you can choose how long you want to last in bed.